We are now in public session. I will invite the public into the gallery.
Isn't it a wee bit of a resemblance? Sheep as they take prisoners. The woman with the fuzzy hair. I'm bringing this woman under 8. I'm dreadful the ones in between. I can't cope with women between 80 and 80. 8 and 80. Last.
Everyone's welcome to today's meeting of the Public Accounts Committee. I must remind you to turn off all mobile phones and electronic devices with the exception of your tablets, which contain your electronic committee meeting pack. It is not sufficient to put mobiles on silent mode as they continue to interfere with the Assembly recording. The session is being recorded in video and audio and can be accessed live by way of online streaming either on the Assembly website or on Democracy Live. If that is clear, I move on to item number 2 on the agenda, apologies. I have received an apology from our chairperson, Ms Boyle, Ms Hannah and Mr Flanagan. Are members aware of any other apologies? Move on to item 3, minutes of the meeting of the 27th of January 2016. Members, the minutes of the last meeting can be found on page 6 of your electronic packs. Are you content with the draft minutes to be signed into the record?
Agreed. Agreed.
Item number 4, matters arising. Pleased to tell you there are no matters arising. Item 5, correspondence. I'm further pleased to tell you there is no new correspondence. So we move on to agenda item 6, inquiry on Invest to Save funding in Northern Ireland, the evidence session. And I'm very pleased to welcome our witnesses. Members, we will now begin our evidence session for the inquiry on Invest to Save funding in Northern Ireland. Do any members wish to declare an interest in this matter?
Yes, Chair. When I was Health Minister, we availed of this scheme. None of the projects I think that I applied for came to fruition during my time, but just to say that I was involved in at least two proposals.
You're probably pleased about that.
Yeah, certainly am.
We have with us today David Sterling, Accounting Officer, DFP, Michael Brennan, Budget Director, DFP, Jeff McGuinness, Grade 7, Central Expenditure Division, DFP. Members, you will find biographies of our witnesses here today on pages 13 and 14 of your electronic pack. I'd like to welcome Ms Codwell as the Treasury Officer of Accounts and Mr Kieran Donnelly as the Controller and Auditor General. Thank you for joining us today. You are all very welcome to the committee. And I suppose I'll begin. The idea of a ring-fenced Invest to Save scheme clearly has merits and has the potential to help departments to identify new and I emphasise innovative ways of delivering services more cost effectively and taking managed risks to reduce costs. Mr Sterling, by way of background, can you explain for the committee the respective roles and responsibilities in relation to the Invest to Save schemes of the key players? In particular, your department, which of course is DFP, the departments funded through the 3 schemes and the executive.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I suppose as far as the respective rules are concerned, obviously DFP's primary purpose is to provide advice to the Finance Minister when he or she brings proposals to the Executive. I suppose we all recognise that one of the most important functions of the Executive is the allocation of resources. And in this case, we're talking about funds which had been set aside from the budget for purposes of invest to save. So DFP invited bids from departments, analysed those bids, provided advice to the Finance Minister, who then took proposals to the Executive. And obviously it's for the Executive then to decide how they wish to allocate resources, taking account of the advice from the Finance Minister. When decisions are finally taken, obviously, and they go through the Assembly process, then the normal financial processes ensure that the funds are allocated to the departments, and then in the normal way there would be departments would spend that money for the purposes for which it's voted, and they would account for that spend again in the normal way.
Okay. Well, looking at Figure 2, can you explain a bit more about the process and involvement of DFP in assessing, selecting and recommending the projects to be funded to the Finance Minister initially and then to the Executive? And of course the members will be particularly listening for reference to innovation and cost-cutting, new and all that stuff.
Figure 2?
Yes.
Sure. Yes, again, I think Figure 2 sort of broadly summarises the process that I described. Is there one particular aspect of the process that you want me to focus in on? Did I pick you up that it was the way in which DFP analysed the bids that come forward?
Well, continue. Well, we're particularly interested to establish how well this fund was used to promote something that was new and wasn't simply consumed as some kind of additional revenue by the different departments.
Okay, yeah, no, I understand the question. One of the issues that the department faced, certainly with one of the most significant allocations of the three funds, was just the limited amount of time that was available, and that would be particularly in relation to the 2010 budget process. I'll maybe ask Mike here just to talk a little bit about the context at the time, because I think it does help explain why some things happened the way they did.
All right, Michael, and obviously the members will need to be convinced that limited time was sufficient reason for what happened.
Okay, Chair. Well, in terms of the first scheme, it became clear to ministers in the closing months of 2009 that the forthcoming spending review from the UK government was going to be a very, very tight one. So there were a series of executive discussions about what that was likely to mean for the future budgets of the executive, and it was decided then that an initiative should be taken for the 2010-2011 year to carve out a small sum of money to try and get departments to focus on policies that they wouldn't normally take forward, that would generate significant savings both in 2010, 2011 and the years thereafter. So I say that the timescale for that first scheme was very, very tight. So for example, it was only on the 21st of December 2009 that the guidance issued, and yet the recommendations went to the Finance Minister in March, the 8th of March. So basically in less than 3 months a scheme was taken forward by officials and delivered to the Finance Minister, all to be in place for the start of the 2010-2011 financial year. That was the first scheme. And I say the initiative was very much focused on driving out savings in departments on a recurring basis.
You do say that there was pressure of time. Presumably the projects were ranked and prioritised, and the aim was to ensure the greatest bang for your buck, to quote the quotation.
Well, the key issue, first of all, was to in such a short period of time, identify projects that were eligible. And what we were looking for were projects that were genuinely deliverable in that time period, projects that would actually generate additional savings, and also projects that were additional. In other words, they were outside of the routine that routine interventions that departments were going to take forward anyway.
Mr. Brennan, you used the term genuine a number of times.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that's not reflected in this report. I mean, can you explain why the scheme, apart from the pressure of time, which I accept, why it didn't achieve the aims that were set out for?
Well,
that was innovation, cost saving, and not simply becoming subsumed into an ordinary budget.
No, I think the schemes were successful in that they did generate significant additional savings, all three schemes.
Okay, we'll come back to that later. Mr. Ross, I throw the... Sorry, I apologise. Jim Wells, far from me to try and cut you out of this. Jim, is it?
Previous chair never had tried something like that, Mr. Chair, but anyhow. Thank you very much for letting me in. Figure 3 of the report indicates that it makes a comparison between our Invest to Save and the rest of the United Kingdom, particularly England and Wales. Theirs seem an awful lot more ambitious than ours, and much broader and focused on potential offered for savings, innovation, transformation, etc. Did you examine other UK schemes before you devised our own?
No, I don't think at the time there was a comparison made with other schemes. But what I would say is that, with the benefit of this report, clearly we have reflected on the findings here, the recommendations, etc. And indeed, we reflected on our experience of this ourselves. So we, for example, there is a change fund, a £30 million change fund within the current executive budget, the 15-16 budget. And that does have a process and a set of criteria which would be more aligned with what would have happened in Great Britain at that stage. I think we would accept, and Mike has already explained that the context was particularly difficult in 2010-11. But we would accept that there are things that we could learn, and indeed I would say we have learned as a result of that.
Forgive me, but that strikes me as something very obvious that has been missed. If you're going to design a bespoke scheme for Northern Ireland, are you telling me that not one of the highly paid civil servants in DFP even spent 5 minutes trying to examine how similar schemes in the rest of the UK operated?
I think the focus was very much on ensuring that we had something that met the particular circumstances confronting ministers in the executive at that time. We were attempting to design something that suited our purposes here. I don't know if you
and just to give you an example of why a scheme had to be constructed that was in some regards unique to Northern Ireland was that the budgets were tight. But if you look, for example, at the Welsh Invest to Save schemes, they were very much focused on what was called cash releasing initiatives. If we had applied the Welsh criteria to Northern Ireland, then many of the schemes that are praised in this report, the non-cash releasing schemes, for example, such as the Dard Lippis scheme, wouldn't actually been able to come forward because the non-cash releasing efficiencies wouldn't have counted. So, the Northern Ireland schemes that we took forward, those three schemes, in many ways had a wider remit, for example, than the Welsh schemes.
It still strikes me as a major omission that 5 minutes wasn't given to see how innovative and successful schemes were in the rest of the UK, and maybe that's part of the reason why the report had to be issued on our schemes.
Well, the other thing to note as well is that the English scheme, for example, ran over an 11-year period from 1999 to 2010. Okay, and as David said, our schemes are evolving. This is really the sixth year of the development of Invest to Save, and the emphasis has changed from generating savings to, as David said, the change fund for 15-16. There's much more of a focus on innovative schemes and reform-driven schemes. So, these initiatives will constantly evolve.
But you're now admitting, of course, you are going back to the drawing board. You're not going to reinvent the wheel. You're going to look at the GB schemes as part of your overall assessment now?
No, I think what I'm saying is the change fund that is actually operational at the moment, if you look at the process around that, some of the criticisms in this report had already been addressed. We had a much clearer set of criteria. We had a much clearer process for analysing bids that came forward. We are producing a mid-year report, and we will be very carefully evaluating the outcomes in the scheme. Now, that's not to say that there will not be evaluations of the Invest to Save funds, which are dealt with in this report. But I'm saying the arrangements that were put in place for the current change fund, the 15-16 change fund, by and large adhere to the recommendations within this report.
So the world does end at Donaghadee.
The world
Ends at Donaghadee. In other words, you didn't look outside your own little territory within the UK until now, when you realised you should have done it years ago.
We accept that we did not look beyond Northern Ireland back in 2010-11, but I think at the time we were very much focused in creating something that met our particular circumstances at that time. But I accept, with the benefit of hindsight, it would have been sensible to look at what had been done elsewhere.
Yeah. Now, there actually were three separate schemes, starting at £26 million and working their way up to funding now, which is £300 million. Did you evaluate the initial scheme before you moved on to 2 and 3?
No, I don't think my colleagues can confirm, but I think the second scheme followed so closely on the first that it wouldn't have been possible to evaluate the outcomes of the allocations made in the first scheme.
Yeah, and indeed the third scheme was commissioned while the second scheme was still running. They were all brigaded together in very, very close timescale. Now, in terms of evaluations, of the 31 schemes that were taken forward, there were 7 that were due to be evaluated by DFP, and those evaluations, are ongoing. I think Jeff can confirm that 3 have been concluded, and 3 aren't actually due yet.
Yes.
So there is an evaluation process in place.
Would it not have been better to have stopped, had a look, learned your lessons, and then moved on to 2 and 3?
Well, the key issue, this was really an initiative driven by the executive. The executive was determined to drive out savings over the 11-15 spending review period. So it was driven by the executive. So, for example, the second scheme, the largest scheme, the 300 million, that was very much an executive-driven agenda. DFP were given a list after ministerial discussions and asked to then engage with departments to take forward those bids that came from that executive discussion.
Jim, if it's okay, I want to call in Roy, but before that, just, Mr. Ryan, I want to go back to you again because I wasn't entirely happy with the answer you gave me. The value of this Invest to Save scheme was 311 million. Only 254 million were actually invested in those types of schemes. And only 2 departments were involved. And even if you take the 2 departments, money, substantial money, a lot of money was reallocated. And 108 million went into structural maintenance. Could you tell me what was innovative about tarring roads?
I didn't say it was innovative, I said it generated savings. The key issue in the report...
Well, sorry, Mr. Wren, for the record, we need to know exactly what the official answer is, because these reports hopefully will be of value in the future.
Well, sorry, can you repeat the question then so I can clarify it?
Well, the question really is, I'm trying to get answers that will be useful to someone in the future who may read these reports.
Right. Well, if the question is, do I believe that the 108 million that was allocated to DRD for structural maintenance...
would you explain to us how that produced innovation, how it was overarching, how it achieved the purpose for which the scheme was introduced in the first place?
I didn't, from recollection, I didn't say that specific scheme was
but that was the question I was asking.
I think we would accept that it's not particularly innovative, but nonetheless...
Sorry, David, what do you mean by particularly innovative? Was it innovative at all?
Well, it was designed, the allocation was designed to secure savings. And, the DRD had commissioned a report in 2009, and indeed I go back to my own time in DRD earlier in the decade, and there's very clear evidence which shows that investment in structural maintenance saves you money in the future. I think the ratio was 1 to 4. If you spend £1 on maintaining the roads, you avoid a potential £4 cost later on. In that sense, allocating money for structural maintenance has delivered a return, has delivered savings for the executive.
Was this just not a handy way to find money that the executive might have been short of?
I blame the minister.
Be careful. I'm calling Roy and then we'll go back to you, Jim. Behave yourself.
On a couple of occasions, you've used the language of this. This is determined by the circumstance facing the executive ministers. What were the particular circumstances that they faced?
Well, I think, as Mike has said, in late 2009, there was a recollection, there was an understanding that the next spending round that would follow the general election in 2010 would be particularly tight, and that therefore the executive needed to anticipate that, needed to take decisions, needed to do things that would help save money.
But how was that any different than all the other devolved regions, or for that matter, the decisions being made at Westminster? They equally would have faced difficult circumstances.
And indeed, and all the devolved administrations, and indeed the UK government, address the challenges in different way, and that's a feature of devolution. We have a choice to do things as we see best fitting our particular circumstances.
What assessment have you made as to which method was the best choices made?
I don't think any high-level assessment has been made as to who coped best with austerity, if you like. That's an interesting question, but I'm not sure that we have done any research to.
Do you not need to assess is the choices that we have made here, or your ministers have made here, compared to how choices made elsewhere have worked out, whether or not it's been the right decision?
There would be so many variables in play, it would be very difficult to make a judgment as to which administration.
There's been no assessment, is that correct? There's been no assessment?
There's been no assessment as to which administration used its resources best to cope with austerity. I think I would put it like that.
Okay, go back to Jim.
I think actually the questions from Roy have actually covered my last question, but basically it's quite clear that had you stopped to think how this invest to save was working out, I think you would have realised that, I'll say this as someone who was involved at one stage, departments were frantically running around looking to find extra money. And so therefore they saw invest to save as a way to get money for things they couldn't otherwise afford. And then they tailored their application to match that, when really, the 108, and as I say, I don't want to impugn the integrity of the minister responsible. I suspect that the extra road maintenance, there's desperation there. So therefore, a clever, cunning plan was brought together to create something that fitted the invest to save criteria, but really was just to get extra money. And therefore wasn't doing what was going on in England and Wales, which was genuinely innovative and groundbreaking and new projects.
Yeah, look, I would acknowledge all of that, but I think at the same time I would have to say that there was nothing underhand about this. Ministers, when they were taking decisions about how the Invest to Save fund should be allocated, were fully aware of the pros and cons of the various schemes. So, in that regard, the process was pretty open and transparent.
I agree, but had you compared it to your colleagues in the rest of the UK, you'd have seen that they were adopting a rather different approach, and it was genuinely new, novel projects.
Yes, but again, at the risk of repeating myself, I think the focus here was very much on delivering cost savings. What I would say is that there is plenty of other activity which has been going on in recent years, which is all about promoting innovation, change and reform of public services, and there's a long list of things and there's a long list of initiatives which have been designed to do that, starting with the voluntary exit scheme in the civil service, which will have reduced the civil service by April this year by 17% in 2 years. We've got departmental restructuring. We've got major reform in the health service, major reform in education. We've reduced the number of councils. We have a cross-cutting reform programme which has got 30 separate projects designed to promote better interdepartmental working, better delivery of services to the citizen. I don't want to sort of get into a long list, but there is a lot of innovative activity going on, and I wouldn't want this report to suggest that we put all our innovation eggs into this one basket, because that wouldn't be fair.
Thank you.
Now I'm going to take an intervention from Edwin, and can remind members, so that we don't get into the difficulty of inching each other's questions, that interventions should be short, succinct and relevant to a particular point.
I've no complaints.
Thank you, Chairman.
Go ahead.
And I don't think this will certainly take anybody else's question. You mentioned the invest to save in relation to the VER scheme. It seems somewhat ironic that someone can leave the civil service and join a health trust. Someone can leave a health trust and with the VER and join the education board. And why is public money being allowed to be used in that way, and yet that not being kept? Are those people able to apply for other jobs in the public sector?
I'm not aware of that particular case, but I would be happy to look into that. But certainly the voluntary exit scheme for the civil service was a measure that has been designed to reduce civil service costs. And we will, by April this year, have allowed, I think, 2,800 or so people to go at a cost of around 80 million, 86 million, I think. And that will pay for itself within 14 months. If there are particular cases like that, I would be happy to look into them. But certainly,
this committee has been asked to address one such case. I'm just saying the credibility of the scheme will be damaged if people are walking out of the front door with a large wad of money in their hip pocket, only to come in through the back door of another particular place to find further employment in the public sector.
Well, obviously our focus is on reducing costs in the Northern Ireland civil service. When somebody leaves, obviously you can't forbid them from gaining employment in other areas. There are limits to the restrictions that we can put on people once they leave our employment. But I'm happy to look into the particular case that you mentioned.
Maybe we're drifting a wee bit, I'm not sure, but I'll go back again to Jim.
No, I'm happy.
You're finished.
Yeah.
Then I go to Mr. Ross Hussey.
Thank you. Gentlemen, if you look at pages 20 and 21 of the report, specifically paragraphs 2.6 to 2.9, and they suggest that DFP's assessment of projects and application selection criteria was very vague and not always very clear. Would you accept that DFP could have done more to improve the selection and recommendation process for projects to receive funding to make it more consistent, transparent and understandable?
Yes, I would accept that we could have taken a more structured approach to this. And again, I would back to the point I would make earlier on. The change fund that is now in place for 15-16, the £30 million change fund, has a more clear-cut set of criteria. There was a better structured assessment methodology and analysis. So I would take on board certainly that general comment that you made. Mike, I don't know if you want to...
Well, you're obviously referring to the here and now, whereas this is what happened in the past.
Yeah.
And I want to deal with that. I mean, yes, you maybe have learned lessons because of this. Is that what you're saying? That you accept that there were mistakes made here, that there are those that are vague and not always clear, that you are now in a position where you've learned from these mistakes?
I accept that we could have maybe done it in a more structured and consistent way. What I would say is there was still quite a significant approach taken to appraisal of the various projects that came forward. There was a lot of interaction between the people in supply division within DFP and departments. So I think I would certainly want to make the point that advice that went to ministers was advice that was constructed following very careful assessment of the various projects.
Several times the comment has been made, it's been driven by the executive. Is that a suggestion that perhaps the ministers didn't actually listen to the advice they were given?
No, not at all.
So therefore, just to get this right in my own head, the civil servants that were allowing this to go forward and giving advice to the ministers were aware of what the circumstances were, that it really wasn't driven by the executive. The executive were advised still by senior civil servants on how to progress.
Yeah, the finance minister got a clear set of advice on each of the projects, and it was based on that advice that the finance minister would have taken advice to other executive ministers.
That's why I want clarity on this, because several times there's been comments driven by the executive and various other comments along those lines, which doesn't seem to be the case to me. It seems to me that the advice was still given. You've accepted that you've learned from your mistakes at that time, so therefore it wasn't as crystal clear as that. It wasn't always driven by the executive. The executive were still receiving advice from yourselves.
There were different approaches taken at different stages of this. For some of the schemes, or part of the schemes, the process was as I described it. Projects come in, they were appraised by, or they were analysed by DFP Supply, and advice was given to ministers. When we talked about the executive having, in a sense, driven part of this, there was one occasion, I'll ask Mike to comment on detail on this, where executive ministers came back to officials having looked at a range of projects and said, these are the ones we wish to support. And I think some of those had not been appraised by officials.
Yeah,
No, well, hold on. I mean, we're going to move on to another paragraph, and maybe your answer may come in on this. If you look at paragraph 2.8, and it provides some reasons why DFP rejected some proposed projects from departments, and they do seem reasonable enough, yet you subsequently seem to have ditched such criteria, as a lot of the projects funded thereafter did not identify savings. They seem to be simply a bid for additional funding, or were not genuine invest to save candidates. What happened here, and how can you justify funding projects such as mentioned in paragraph 2.10, for example, ILEC City of Culture or the Northern Ireland direct bid? Where were the savings that were actually going to be there? Now, I'm not criticising the actual projects, but I want to know where you can identify where the savings were there.
No, well, if you take the ILEX City of Culture project, that's a good example, which in a sense demonstrates, I think, the points I was trying to make. That is a project where DFP did look at that, and we did identify that whilst the project had very considerable merits, nonetheless it wasn't going to deliver significant cost savings, and that advice was given to the finance minister. Nonetheless, ministers, as is entirely their right, decided that they wanted to support that project. So in that sense, you have the normal approach to government, which is civil servants advise, ministers decide. Figure 6 shows that the structural maintenance of roads programme received £108 million from the Invest to Save fund. Invest to Save funding was also provided to your department's land and property services rating project to enable the baseline to be set at a reasonable level. Aren't both these projects just increasing the overall conventional funding available? And was this really the purpose of Invest to Save, to simply fund ongoing mainstream activities and help them survive a budget cut? Yeah, look, I can understand the criticism, but I think I would sort of emphasise the point I made already, which is in both these cases, significant savings were realised and a return was achieved on the monies that were invested.
And the other key point to bear in mind is that if these bids put forward had been assessed in the context of the general budget process and the evaluation, Road Service may not have got £108 million of money for structural maintenance, or DFP would not have got the money that it was looking for in terms of a general bid for LPS. These were ring-fence funds that in many ways made it more straightforward to justify their application because they did generate significant savings over the long term. So as I say, because they specifically because they did generate savings, which is why they were funded from the ITS, their bid ranking under the general bid assessment as part of the budget process may have scored them lower.
But again, it's back to the question, it does look as if perhaps in these circumstances you were just increasing the overall convention funding available. When you look at it coldly, you're saying that they mightn't have passed the other criteria, therefore we put them in under Plan B. It's like the plans that Mr Wells was talking about earlier. It seems like a Baldric plan. It's a cunning plan, so we'll use that. You see where I'm coming from here. If it doesn't fit into that one, we'll slip it into that one.
Yeah, look, I accept that the outcome was, as you describe, £108 million extra went into structural maintenance funding, but it was understood what was happening. There was no subterfuge. There was no attempt to sort of hide what was happening. This was recognised at the time that this is a decision. This was the nature of the decision that was being taken.
And it reflects, the wider ministerial discussions that you referred to earlier as part of that scheme too, which was the large £300 million scheme. There were a number of ministerial decisions, executive decisions there on allocations, whether it be the City of Culture or the Decal Sports Community Programmes. They were the important ministerial and executive decisions.
Okay. If you look at paragraph 3.8 on page 33, and you'll see in that paragraph that some potential applicants appeared to have been put off because their schemes were capital in nature. Would you agree that upfront capital investment is often a good way of generating future savings?
Indeed, yes.
So overall here, what lessons can you draw from this, and how can you improve the operation of future schemes so that capital projects are encouraged and supported and given time to develop their applications?
Well, the key point here is to make sure that there's sufficient time, and it's the point that David made earlier about the change fund, for example, that we're taking forward now. The Minister's announced that will be determined in June monitoring, the coming June. So departments have been, the issue and the opportunity to bid for capital has been flagged up to departments well in advance.
Do you think, overall, and again I've made several notes along here, innovation or managed risks taking, do you believe that you're now at that stage, that is actually what you're actually doing? The projects that are innovative and there is a managed risk, you're actually now more supportive of that type?
Yeah, I think if you look at the projects that are being funded by the £30 million change fund for 15-16, and the projects that are going to be funded by the £7 million that have been allocated so far for the change fund in 16-17, they are designed to promote innovative approaches to long-standing problems. So, in that sense, I think we can show evidence of us working to promote innovative activity across the public sector.
One of the key aims of the Change Fund is to encourage innovation in the public sector and support the introduction of new and more proven ways of working. So one of the actual essential criteria is that the proposal is reform-orientated and innovative. So that's very much the focus of the Change Fund.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, I'll move on to Roy.
I'd like to go back initially to the road structural maintenance funding that went in. And from previous PAC hearings, I'm well aware that it's more efficient to do planned maintenance than regularly fill in potholes and keep filling in the potholes. That can be very expensive. But I note in the application for funding for structural maintenance that there was not even an attempt to estimate the savings that was expected to generate from this application, nor did it report whether any specific savings were subsequently delivered. Why not?
Well, I think the report does show that an estimation of the savings that have accrued has been made. And that I take the point you make there. I don't know if you want to pick up on the
So nothing's been reported, but what has been reported? What has been the estimate of the savings?
Well, as the Audit Office report flags up, there's previous studies, independent academic studies, that show that the savings that you get from preemptive rather than reactive structural maintenance, for every pound invested, you generate £4 worth of savings. So certainly, from a DFE supply perspective, officials are well aware of that research.
Would you acknowledge that to the public this doesn't seem to be very innovative? It's just really another form of funding then, that where you haven't actually looked at this invest to save criteria that was meant to be a key bit of this funding?
Well, you know, I would acknowledge that it's a method of investing in roads that does generate significant savings.
Okay.
Sorry, can I just maybe add to that? In terms of the scheme, that was the second scheme that ran across 2011 to 15, and the criteria that we provided to departments was focused really on the savings generated as opposed to innovation. So it was more focused on savings than innovation at that stage.
Okay. I'll turn to paragraph 2.10, which illustrates quite a number of projects which were allocated invest to save funding. You know, maybe perhaps what's just been said, it should have been given a different title. This doesn't seem to be about invest to save necessarily. And you look at these numerous projects, not one of them identified or quantified the savings that would be made. Would you acknowledge that your title is different to what you've been doing?
Well, the allocations were made on the basis that savings were expected, and a calculation has been made of the savings that have accrued from each of the projects. But you're right, we didn't set a target for the savings that were to be delivered from those allocations at that time. But sorry, that doesn't decry the fact that savings have been delivered.
I'll turn to one bid, actually from DFP, which is NI Direct, and it says that no savings but related to improve service delivery to the public. So no savings were delivered in this Invest to Save scheme. You find that very strange that you, the department that are meant to be driving this innovation and Invest to Save yourselves, did not attempt to quantify any savings?
I think as far as the allocation to NI Direct was concerned, there were no immediate cash releasing savings. What we were doing was creating a website, a contact centre. But the establishment of that contact centre did in due course release, I think, about £2.4 million worth of cash, which was reinvested. And I think there was about 350,000 of efficiency savings per annum has been generated as well.
And why was that not recorded as part of the bid process?
I think it was, well, these were benefits that accrued afterwards and would not have been reasonably anticipated at the time.
As a local councillor, when previously allocating LSP, local strategy funding, peace funding, there would have been a grid matrix, and you'd had to assess very carefully every bid and have a certain number of points awarded to every application. Was there any grid at all, or was this left entirely flexible? Was there a scoring mechanism used for each project?
When it came to the assessment of the projects?
In determining which ones were funded?
I'm not sure if there was a matrix used, but each of them were assessed against the criteria that applied at the time.
If it's good enough to assess for thousands of pounds in projects, why has there not been a matrix used for these £1 million projects?
Again, at the time, I think the process was seen to be appropriate for what we were trying to do. But I accept that we have learned lessons from that and have applied them, as I described earlier, to subsequent reform-related allocations.
In terms of the change fund to 2015-16, we have learnt those lessons. We have clear assessment criteria and a scoring matrix that ranks each of the essential criteria and each of the desirable criteria by a point system. There was also a mechanism put in place to ensure the standardisation of scoring and consistency in approach right across.
Okay. I've noticed in the executive summary that it says it's more difficult to implement an Invest to Save scheme in a jurisdiction with a mandatory coalition with different policy aims than it is in a jurisdiction with a much stronger degree of collegiate cooperation and cohesion. Why was such a scoring mechanism not put in early, and would that not have actually assisted things if that mechanism you just spoke of was put in right from the start?
Well, I think, as I've explained earlier, we accept that the appraisal process that we applied at the time could have been more consistent and more structured. We have learned that lesson, I think.
At the time, each department would have had its own efficiencies and savings program, delivery program. What was different from this so-called Invest to Saves program from what individual departments were doing on their own?
Well, I think what was different about this was that the executive had decided to set funds aside, which, when allocated, would yield savings. So that would have been complementary to what departments were doing. I think, as I said earlier, there's a range of reforming activity going on and has been going on for some time. Some of it is cross-cutting, some of it results from the allocation of funds set aside for the specific purpose, and some is being taken forward by departments with their own resources.
The other important difference to make is that from 2007, all departments have been obliged to follow what was initially called efficiency delivery plans and then became known as savings delivery plans, where effectively these imposed budget restrictions of, I think, initially 2%, 2.5%, and then 3%. So the imperative was on the departments to live within those constraints, those savings delivery plan constraints. The benefit of this system was that a fund was carved out and held at the centre. Departments then could make applications to generate savings to the betterment of that department and the block. So, that was the key fundamental difference here. One was internalising the savings within the departments. The other was creating an opportunity to take forward something that probably wouldn't have happened and generate savings to the betterment of the department and the block.
Mr. Sterling, can you give me an illustration of projects funded through the Invest to Save which were different than what projects themselves could or would have funded under their own steam?
Off the top of my head, I think the LPIS, the Land Parcel Identification Scheme in Dard, was a scheme which would not have gone ahead without this funding, and which, the Audit Office report itself acknowledges delivered very significant benefits in terms of allowing us to put in place arrangements which helped us to avoid very significant infraction fines.
Would you acknowledge that the vast majority of them wouldn't be that sort of specialist area where there were significant savings perhaps generated or avoidance of fines, that most of them were just more run-of-the-mill projects that people could run to produce some savings?
I think our estimation of the savings that have accrued in total to 2015-16 is in the region of 456 million. I think I'm right, Jeff. So, the investment has produced significant benefits, notwithstanding some of the issues that I've acknowledged in earlier discussion.
Roy, just sorry, could I read there? Did I pick up there that you're saying that the Save to Invest scheme money was used to provide resources to DARD to avoid infraction fines, and you call that savings?
I think I called it a benefit.
No, you said savings, but it doesn't matter. I'm happy to accept the correction. But it just seems bizarre to me that, ring-fenced money that was provided to encourage genuine savings has now been claimed as a resource to avoid infraction fines.
I would be the first to accept that this seems a little strange in the way it's described, but nonetheless, I think that the reality was, in those days, whenever resources were extremely tight, there was, I think, a recognition that without some action, we would incur those infraction fines. The allocation that was made for this project allowed a system to be developed, a very good system, which has actually meant that we haven't had any disallowance and we haven't incurred any infraction fines.
In your own personal assessment and your professional judgment, do you believe that was what the fund was intended for?
The fund was intended, I suppose, to help the executive manage its limited resources at that time. This allocation did allow the executive to avoid quite a significant infraction fine. I would be the first to accept your point that it may not accord with what most people would sort of regard as being a normal invest to
I'm
save
worried-
type scheme, but it did provide very significant
I'm worried,
benefits.
David, as time goes on, that it's becoming more and more sounding like a slush fund rather than something that was attached to innovation. But, Roy, go ahead.
Yes, I mean, if this fund hadn't been around, would you have thought that that particular scheme would have been prioritised by the department by the Department of Agriculture itself, because of the huge significant cost that would have fell upon it?
I just don't know. Again, I can't comment on what the various other pressures the department faced at that time and what steps they would have taken if they hadn't got that allocation.
Would you accept that most would we could easily get an impression this was entirely flexible, vague criteria of funding which you could use for whatever you wanted?
Again, at the risk of repeating myself, this was all entirely open. Ministers knew what they were allocating the funds to and the purpose of those allocations at the time.
Are you saying it suited the ministers to have a slush fund?
No, I think it's. I wouldn't accept that it's called a slush fund at all. I think that's unfair. It was an invest to save fund, as Jeff has described. The criteria for the main fund were that it was that these allocations were to be designed to produce savings, and by and large, I think the report itself shows that significant savings and benefits did accrue.
Okay. Turning to paragraph 211, we're told that about a fifth of the invest to save funding was used for voluntary exit schemes and voluntary redundancy schemes. Would you accept that these seem to have delivered more tangible savings and ultimately long-term savings?
I think these were successful schemes, and again, this is an example of where the Invest to Save fund did provide departments with an opportunity to do things that otherwise they wouldn't have been able to do, which produce savings.
Okay.
The outcomes are recorded here.
And how confident are you on the figures that have been provided, that they are robust and that the savings indicated have actually been delivered in terms of ongoing reduced headcount and ongoing savings?
Well, I take the savings that have been reported at face value. It would be for each individual accounting officer responsible for the individual allocations to satisfy themselves that the savings were being generated. I think that's the way I would look at it.
Would you have to be advised, for instance, if somebody decided to backfill some of the vacancies that were created? Is there any formal mechanism that you would have to be notified if, having made some savings, that an additional post was not created and filled again?
I don't believe that was the case for these voluntary exit schemes, but what I would say is that
So they wouldn't have had to notify you? If
no, I don't know.
No, I suppose the key issue in terms of all these schemes is that when the bids were approved, the onus was very much on the individual departments to deliver the savings, because if they didn't deliver those savings, then they would have breached their budgets. So the onus is on the departments, each individual department, to make sure that they implemented and delivered, as they said they would, on the 31 schemes.
And did these schemes contribute to your knowledge and design of the ultimate voluntary exit scheme that's just been implemented?
Yeah, so that's the point I was going to make, is that, as you will know, the executive created a transformation fund, which is using the funds allocated through the Stormed House Agreement, the £700 million, to fund the civil service voluntary exit scheme and a large number of other exit schemes across the public sector. And we will be putting in place central monitoring arrangements to ensure that the savings which those schemes are designed to deliver will be delivered.
Turning now to Appendix 2 in the report and the savings that were claimed and the amount of funding that went toward it and actual outcome. How robust do you think the figures that were provided here? And I noticed that there are occasions where no specific savings for the programme or project is recorded.
That's the DART scheme.
A number of schemes. There's City of Culture, there's NI Direct, there's DARD.
Well, the DART scheme, the report there acknowledges that 41.2 million of EU fines have been avoided for the 3 years in question. The City of Culture project, I think we discussed that earlier, and I think, when the allocation was made, it was recognised that there weren't going to be any specific cost savings as a result of it, but very significant benefits have been realised for the city.
When you look at the summary of the Invest to Save scheme over this period, 2011-2015, and there is quite a number of the schemes which say that no specific savings for the programme are available. As the DFP accounting officer, do you not feel any form of embarrassment that you or your predecessors have saw a scheme which is meant to be about savings, where no specific savings can be identified?
Well, again, I quoted the figure 456.4 million are the savings which we believe have been accrued to date from the allocations that were made. The fact that some schemes may not have had some specific savings, nonetheless, I think every one of the allocations has yielded some particular benefits.
So no, just to say, for example, you made reference to the NI Direct, no specific savings. It's 2/14/15, but as David has clarified earlier, that scheme has actually generated cash releasing savings.
But yet under the grounds that the funding was allocated was funding savings during the period, you're recording here that no specific savings were recorded. Now, my understanding in business, if somebody was going to their board or the owner of a business and wanting to get investment for a particular project to get savings, you'd have to provide a business plan when those savings would come in. And it's very difficult to actually even go to a bank and get savings unless it's tangible and it comes relatively upfront early in the scheme, so you can deliver it and you can show results. So is it not rather strange that the summary of this scheme is frequently saying no specific savings identified?
Well, we could go down each of the individual projects and identify the benefits which did accrue. I think all have provided value for money. Some have provided very significant savings, some not so much. But if you take it in the round, the investment has yielded a significant return.
What was the role of DFP and an accounting officer in monitoring these schemes when what we're getting here is no specific savings? I mean, what was DFP doing in terms of the monitoring of the scheme?
Well, again, at that stage, there was no central monitoring of the allocations. The allocations
There
were
was
being
no monitoring?
Sorry, there was no central monitoring of the allocations. The allocations were made to departments. It was for accounting officers to ensure that the allocations delivered value for money and delivered the savings that were projected for the schemes.
And who did the accounting officers report to?
Their minister.
And ultimately, where does all this financial information come back to?
Accounting officers report to their minister. They don't report to anybody else.
Sorry, David, maybe I could be of help here. Obviously, DFP was the central department that best knew the aims and objectives of the scheme. Is it not amazing that that department didn't have a central monitoring system where they could, if you like, validate the outcomes against the aims and objectives? And instead, you're telling Roy, I think, or telling the committee, there was no central monitoring. In other words, there was nobody in control of the scheme. Each person or accounting officer did their own wee thing in their own department. And then you get crazy things like 3.5 million allocated to eating disorders, which I would have thought the general public would have thought, now isn't that clever? Because we have serious problems with anorexia, obesity and so on. And then we discovered the money was handed back and it was never implemented. Nobody was monitoring or controlling all this.
Well, As I explained, there was no central monitoring of the allocations at that time, but certainly
But how can you claim success for the scheme when the key point of any scheme is somebody in control?
Well,
You
the normal process is, the normal way things work is it is for individual accounting officers to account for all the allocations that are made to their particular department. The Invest to Save Fund was no different from that regard. DFP doesn't produce an overall assessment of the value for money that is delivered by the allocations made to individual departments.
So nobody really knows what happens until the audit office comes along, does a report, and by that stage, the horse is bolted.
Well, I think what happened with this scheme is as I've described it. But again, as I pointed out earlier on, with the 15-16 change fund, we have put in place arrangements to monitor the savings and the benefits that have accrued. There will be central reporting. There will be mid-year assessments. So, in that sense, we have changed the procedures that applied at the time of the improved the procedures that applied.
Back to Roy, does anybody take responsibility for what I believe was a huge gaffe? I mean, is anybody accountable for things, for errors of omission in this case, I presume, to put it nicely, that there was no central monitoring, there was no assessment of what was happening, how the money spent was matching the aims and objectives of the scheme?
There is very clear accountability. The accountability rests with the accounting officer.
We know. Sorry, the accountability in the sense that the scheme represented value for money and lived up to the aims and objectives of the scheme.
At the time, there was no collation of the impact of the individual projects. But we are doing that now with the recent change fund. But sorry, at risk of repeating myself, it is a fundamental principle that it is accounting officers that are responsible for the funds that are allocated to them. The FP doesn't take that responsibility away from accounting officers.
Well, that's maybe another issue, and maybe that's for a future assembly. But in your own opinion, do you think it's time you really took some responsibility for what your departments are doing?
Well, I can't personally be responsible for what other departments are doing. But what I said is, sorry, with the change fund in 15-16, we have taken responsibility in terms of asking departments to provide a return on the benefits that are accruing. We are monitoring that, and we will be reporting on that.
Sure, you have a monitoring role in the budget.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. We have been exercising that with the change fund in 15-16.
Well, I welcome any clarification you're given, because it would absolutely horrify me that you doled out £311 million, then you take no responsibility for how departments spent it.
Again, it is for accounting officers to be accountable for the monies allocated to them.
People in the public will probably want to know the same question, particularly those who have, in many ways, suffered as a result of the hard times you referred to earlier. Roy?
Just a final question in terms of this. DFP distributed the money on this scheme.
Sorry, ministers decided on the allocations too.
But it was managed. The process was managed by DFP, correct? Or who did the assessment, the matrix, etc.?
Yep.
Okay. So DFP had a key role in this scheme. Was it not your role to safeguard the integrity of the scheme, ensure that it actually delivered savings?
I am repeating myself here. DFP provided advice on the projects to the Finance Minister.
Did you provide direction?
Sorry?
Did you provide direction?
It wouldn't be our role to provide direction.
Well, that explains then the Horlicks we ended up with. No direction at all, even though you were money bags. You were the people who had the money. There's no direction to the departments how you spend it.
Sorry, Chair. There appears to be a misunderstanding about the role of DFP officials, ministers,
What
etc.
I'm picking up is that you're taking no responsibility.
No. We're responsible for providing advice to the finance minister. We did that.
Did you provide direction? Because there was direction provided in England and Wales.
We provided guidance to
we provided
departments.
Yeah.
Sorry, could I hear Jeff?
We provided guidance to departments, yes.
I can't provide direction to ministers. You know that. I'm very clear. My role is that I am under the direction and control of my minister, as are all accounting officers.
You are the permanent government.
No, I most certainly am not.
And you know you are. Right.
I'm under the direction and control of my
Are you
minister.
saying you can give good advice, but ministers can choose to ignore your good advice? Is that what you're saying?
I wouldn't put it in that way. Ministers are entirely free to decide on matters such as how resources are allocated on the basis of political priorities, the advice we give, the advice others give. My role is simply to make sure that we give advice which is balanced, fair, proportionate and objective. And I think we did in this case.
Would you accept that the distribution of funding under this scheme, showing the political priorities that were actually determined in terms of the outcomes, would appear to be different from the concept of the scheme, of an invest to save scheme?
No, I don't think I would.
You're being incredibly loyal. Because I think if you examine many of the projects where no savings were identified and little potential of establishing funding, I do not understand how some of these projects were funded under this scheme.
Well, the outcome of the decisions that were taken by ministers are set out before us. The impact of those allocations, again, has been set out before us. I have made the point that our estimation of the savings which have accrued in total as a result of these investments is around 456 million. And on that high-level basis, I think the investment has provided value. If you look at the individual projects, I think each of them has provided value. Even if some of them have not resulted in cash releasing savings, nonetheless they have provided a return.
Just going back to this issue of it's more difficult to manage such a scheme in this jurisdiction. Was there bartering going on between ministers? We'll let you do this if we get this. Was that what was happening?
I don't know what was going on, but
sorry, you don't know what was going on?
Well, I wasn't there at the time. I only joined the department in
any
July
of your
2014.
Were any of you there at the time?
I was there, yes, and as the report makes clear, some of the schemes that were advanced were, ministerial commitments and issues agreed in ministerial bilaterals and in executive discussions. So it was the outworkings of the executive's determination as to where the Invest to Save funds would go. The reference to the political environment, I suppose when you have a mandatory coalition, you're going to have different sets of priorities, whereas if you have a single party government, you have an agreed single view of what the priority should be and you advance on that basis.
But if there had been a robust matrix from the start, that would have made it self-evident the priority projects. Do you accept that?
And we've moved to, as Jeff said, we've moved to that basis for the change fund.
Why did you ever establish such a large scheme in the first place without that basis?
Well, I think, again, it was ministers that determined the size of the funding envelope that was to be made available. And again, you seem to be suggesting that if there had been a matrix with a very careful objective analysis of all projects, that would have led to an easy set.
To meet the names of the scheme?
I would still say that even if you had that entirely objective analysis of all the projects, you will still have a certain amount of political discussion about what are the priorities. Because, as Mike has said, different parties have different priorities, and whenever they are deciding on how allocations are to be made, there will be debate about what relative priorities should be.
Okay. Before calling in Conor, at least to be thought I might be trying to be controversial, I want to refer you to paragraph 5 of the report, which says, In Northern Ireland, the definition of invest to save and the scope of proposals was broad. While this may have led to more applications coming forward, at least in the initial scheme of 2010-11, in our view, it has not provided the same direction or focus as it did in similar schemes that have operated in England and Wales. We find it difficult in some cases to identify the boundaries between invest to save funding and conventional funding. That's the point I was making earlier. And because this was a specific scheme that was designed to, with particular aims and objectives, I query whether the same flexibility should have been available for ministers to barter over it. I mean, it was there for a particular reason. I suggested that your department had a responsibility to provide direction.
Forgive me, Chair, bridling at the word direction because it sits very uncomfortably with a senior official. You know, we give guidance, but it would not be our role to direct.
I understand where you're coming from in your normal role.
Yeah.
And but because this was a specific scheme, am I wrong in suggesting that you should have been providing direction?
Direction to?
How the scheme would meet its aims and objectives?
Direction to ministers?
Yes, to departments.
Well, we provided guidance to departments which they then used to construct the bids that came to us. We've discussed the adequacy of that guidance. We've accepted that, with hindsight, we might have made the guidance slightly tighter, but the guidance at the time was designed to reflect the context and circumstances that applied at the time.
Now, I'm sure no one would want to believe for a moment that ministers hijacked the fund in the year before an election and did their own thing with it, and I hope that's not what you're suggesting.
No, not at all.
All right.
Absolutely not at all.
Okay, well, I suppose what we are agreed on is that in a time of tightened finances, schemes like this are a good idea if they're designed to firstly save money from departments that are designed to promote innovation and risk-taking. Risk-taking seems to have disappeared in terms of this one. And it's clear from the outworkings of it that, you know, innovation and risk-taking took very much a back seat, and savings became the dominant view in relation to all that. So I think we're agreed that schemes like this are a good idea if they're properly delivered and the outputs are measured and the value of the scheme can be shown. And we're also agreed that in this one there were shortcomings. And I suppose we don't need a crystal ball to agree that there are going to be further tightened finances across the public sector for at least the next number of years. And so schemes of this nature and other schemes that are in the system are going to have to be delivering effectively. And that's part of the analysis of where this scheme came up short. Now, DFP's role, except, is to provide advice to the Minister. It has the other role in terms of its relationship with other departments. And so, I mean, Mike mentioned, you know, about the across-the-board cut. The DFP, they do that. So they have the watchdog policing role in the other departments, the dark side, as some civil servants used to refer to them, to deliver that. So it's not just simply, the DFP don't just simply channel through their own minister into the executive. They channel through permanent secretaries and the head of the civil service into the other departments. So a scheme like this is devised, its origins are in DFP, because that's where the money-saving initiatives have to come from. It's a well-intentioned scheme. You sell it to your own minister, the perm sec, or whoever, and the minister sells it to the executive. So you're up and ready to go with such a scheme, and you've designed it to have decent outcomes. I presume then there is a meeting at some stage of the other meeting that takes place between the head of the civil service and the permanent secretaries of the departments, and they discuss this scheme has been rolled out. The executive has agreed it. Is there an instruction then given to perm secs that they need to bring forward schemes which actually reflect what is intentioned in this? That everybody understands. This is at the other meeting, not the executive meeting, but the meeting among senior civil servants, to say, right, we understand what the nature of this scheme is, what it's designed to achieve. the executive has approved this, we're good to go with it, and we want to see this type of scheme come forward. Would that happen in terms of those discussions?
No, it wouldn't. It wouldn't work quite like that. Right. The permanent secretaries meet weekly, but it would not be on the agenda to. I can't think of an example in recent times where a meeting like that would have been used to explain a particular fund like this, or to direct other permanent secretaries to do anything as a result of a fund being created, for example, the Change Fund. But there would be meetings of finance directors of all departments, where if a scheme like this came forward, Mike's team would explain to the finance directors what the scheme was all about. And maybe you want to pick up how you would deal with it.
Just to say, the schemes would have been an item on the agenda for the finance director meetings. Departments would have had an opportunity to discuss, the rollout of the scheme, the guidance and timetable. Those are all the issues that would have been raised. And I have to say, at those meetings there were no substantive concerns raised. But in addition to all that, there is the regular interaction that takes place between the departments and their individual supply officers and DFP at their stocktake sessions. So there's quite a interactive process in terms of DFP and the departments on the rollout of these schemes. So
the departments, through whatever means of communication, are clear what the nature of the scheme is and what it's intended to achieve. And they're also clear what projects that they need to bring forward to their minister for approval to be part of the scheme. I mean, you have the DFP hold the card and the stick. The stick is your 3% or whatever percentage cut across the board. The card are schemes like this, which you incentivise departments to make further savings with a reward of getting money to invest in things which will achieve all of that. And so departments are clear in that regard as to what's intended as a consequence, whatever level it comes through. And obviously, if it comes through at a finance director level, it goes back up to the permanent secretaries, so they understand what game is going on here.
Yeah.
Would you consider then, because of the deficiencies in the outcome of all of this, and some of it didn't meet what it was designed to do, some of the money was spent on things which are stretching the trade description of being invest to save, that perhaps there wasn't that level of buy-in in terms of how the scheme was devised and intended from DFP among the senior levels of civil service?
There may well not have been at the time. Actually, just if I can slightly correct something I said earlier, by way of example, in the recent budget, the executive allocated £4.5 million for a cross-cutting reform programme. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, there are 31 projects in that. A lot of them are about increasing the use of digitalisation across the service, enhancing the shared services, doing a range of other innovative things. I can go through them in detail. In that particular instance, there was a discussion amongst the permanent secretaries whenever the projects were being put forward, and there was encouragement that people should focus in on developing and bringing forward good projects. There is also a commitment now that we will bring quarterly reports to the permanent secretary group, setting out the progress against these projects. So in that sense, yes, we have changed.
Is that a consequence of the experience of this particular scheme?
Not directly. We would have been aware of this report, but I think it's fair to say that over the last year, under Malcolm McKibben's leadership, there's been a clear recognition amongst permanent secretaries that departments, senior officials, need to be more cooperative, more collaborative, particularly if we're to deliver the next programme for government. We're going to have a reduced number of departments. We are going to quite clearly, there's a sense amongst ministers now that we need to tackle some of the major issues that have bedevilled us for a long time. And if we're to do that, we need to work better across government. We need to work better across the different sectors, the community, the voluntary sector, local government, the private sector. And that means that permanent secretaries, as I say, need to be more collaborative. And we are working in that way much more. That's been evident over the last year.
Is there also a recognition then, and I'm interested in this in terms of getting better outcomes into the future,
Yep.
There a recognition that if a scheme like this comes forward, that in departments they don't throw a new overcoat on old projects, and dress them up to match
Absolutely.
whatever DFP are offering up.
Yes.
And then part of the ensuring that that happens, obviously, then is the other function of DFP in terms of its monitoring of departments. Now, you said in relation to this, which it surprised me also, there's no central monitoring function. I presume that has now been corrected, and that DFP, through the PermSec meeting or through however DFP's normal engagement with the whatever level of official engagement department, will ensure that there's a regular monitoring of programmes, so that you don't, in some cases, it seems clear to me you don't have that level of buy-in. At certain level, some officials took these, and ministers are complicit in this. I accept that, because the officials come and recommend a series of projects, and they say we could get money if we go and do this. But in some of these cases, it's clearly money that should have been got through the department's own budgets, or money that didn't meet, even with a stretch, invest to save type. It didn't encourage innovation or risk taking. And it's questionable in some of the projects whether they actually had any savings materialise as a consequence of them. So what is going to happen into the future? What's DFP's role going to be in relation to making sure that in future times, when budgets are going to be even tighter, that there is proper buy-in across the civil service, that schemes are brought forward genuinely out of departments which match what they're intended to do, and that those are the schemes which are actually put forward to a minister to approve, not schemes which people think, well, we need to spend this. Let's tinker this up. Let's put a few new ribbons on it and dress it up a bit and stick it out there as invest to save, and maybe we'll be lucky.
A personal view, I think it's unlikely. I think it's highly unlikely that there would be another invest to save scheme of the magnitude that we have here, £300 million. I think it's more likely that we will have more schemes like the 15-16 Change Fund, which has got 30 million attached to it, and the cross-cutting reform programme, which again has 30 projects at a value of £4.5 million. Both those cases, clear criteria, better assessment, better reporting. That will be the way we will take these things forward in the future. So, to that extent, the concerns that members have addressed have aired today have been recognised and are being addressed. And I can't see us doing something like this again.
And if I could just add to that, as David said, these three schemes are really departments operating in their little individual silos, which in many ways does constrain opportunities to maximise savings in the future moving forward. And the whole approach has changed significantly over the last year or so. And if I can give you a specific example, for example, the asset management strategy that the executive is taking forward, it's now set up with all the departments working. There's a programme board that reports directly to FN and DFM on a quarterly basis in terms of the outworkings of the work that the asset management units are taking to deliver that. So it is more cross-cutting in its approach and in terms of reporting the outcomes.
And that brings me on to the last point again. It's been raised a couple of times. This is kind of, I'm not saying it's a justification or excuse, was floated in this about mandatory coalition and a clear reference to different political. I mean, even in single party, you're going to get ministers with different ambitions and ambitions to protect their own departments and spend money on projects which reflect well on them. That's the nature of any administration. I mean, in this case, I'm not sure. I'd like to hear some further explanation why you would feel the mandatory coalition were. Are you saying there was differences between the political parties, a tug of war? Given that one of the principal, I suppose, transgressors in terms of taking this money and actually, without even trying to dress it up, spent it on other issues, was the health department, which would have been the same ministerial colleague party as the finance minister at the time. So I'm not sure how valid even to float the notion across here, because it gets picked up as if, but the problem wasn't really that there was buy-in at senior level in the civil service. The problem really wasn't that these silos were operating. The problem was something to do with politics. And I'd like just some further explanation of how that added to some of the factors that you've already outlined in terms of departments doing their own thing anyway.
Yeah. It's a good point, and I suppose when we made that observation to the Audit Office, I suppose we were sensitive that it could be misconstrued, and I wouldn't want it to be. I think we were simply seeking to explain that our context is very different from many other jurisdictions. It wasn't to make a political comment in any way at all. It's simply a reflection that we have 4 parties in the executive at the moment who, I think it's fair to say, have quite different ideologies in many areas. Would have different.
There's not actually 5
in the executive at the moment.
One ran away.
I'm wary about saying the wrong thing here, but I think it's 4 at the moment. But say different priorities, different objectives, and that just means when it comes to this fundamental function of allocating resources, I think it probably is a little more difficult than in jurisdictions where you've got a single party, albeit I would accept that there are often differences within a single party that can be just as great as between different parties. But when you have that collection of people, let's say, with different backgrounds, it is inherently, I think, more difficult. But I make no particular point other than the contextual one.
Yeah, but I mean, the actual outcome of this wasn't a battle over spending money in different communities. The outcome of this was departments spending money that they shouldn't have spent on this scheme. So there was no political ideology to how the money was spent. The money was spent within departments on things like roads maintenance and on health priorities. They weren't political priorities. They weren't, schemes which advantage one political party over another. So that makes me wonder at the reference at all, because the actual outcome that's drawn attention to in this report, there were no politics attached to this spending. Departments dressing up.
Yeah.
Money they wanted to spend, and not in all cases, but in some of these cases, in some of the more obvious cases, dressing up money they wanted to spend in health or invest to save schemes, and find out they're a DFP not properly following up their own idea.
Yeah, no, I would accept that, and certainly there was never meant to be any suggestion on our part that there were party politics being played in the way in which the funds available were actually allocated out. That I accept that wasn't the case at all.
Okay, sorry.
No, I'm finished.
Jim?
In paragraph 3 of the executive summary, there's a highlighting of how in a previous report in 2011 we emphasised the importance of your department properly tracking and monitoring ring-fenced funds. However, in paragraph 214, it shows that the department, this is the Department of Health, and I want to emphasise that I wasn't the minister. I wasn't the minister at this stage. That paragraph shows that 52 million of Invest to Save funding was taken by the Department of Health and used in other areas. Now, I have absolutely no doubt, knowing the department, that those are absolutely essential pressures within the budget, and the money hadn't been found. But how could you say that you were monitoring when this was allowed to happen, and was it within the rules of the scheme?
No, I don't think we did say we were monitoring. We have taken this up with DHSSPS, and their explanation for this is that they believe that they were entitled to allocate resources available to them freely. We differ on that. Our view, I think it's clearly the Audit Office view as well, is that there wasn't full flexibility, that these were ring-fenced funds, and that permission should have been sought before they could have been reallocated to other priorities. The Department advises us that this was a genuine error on their part, if you like, and they've accepted that the money should have stayed within its ring fence. On the back of that, we have reinforced the guidance to departments about the use of ring-fenced funds, and the Department of Health have accepted that they need to be very careful with this type of funding in the future.
And when did you become aware that the £52 million had sort of wandered, as it were?
Well, this was a goal for the Audit Office. We didn't spot it. It was the Audit Office caught this when they were conducting this review.
It's only £52 million. It went astray, presumably to a very good cause. I mean, I think I've no idea where it was spent, but I'm certain, knowing the department, there were incredibly important pressures that simply had to be dealt with, and the money was spent accordingly. But it does lend it to Mr Murphy's contention that cunning plans were going on all over the place within the 11 departments, and that they desperately needed the money. It was the application was tailored to meet the criteria, and then it was spent on pressures which were going to be coming up anyhow, and they weren't particularly innovative or money saving.
I've no reason to believe there was anything cynical about this. I've been assured that those that reallocated the funds were reallocating them to the very intense pressures in the health service that you would be very aware of from your time as minister. Those would be pressures on A&E, elective care, domiciliary care, the whole range of difficult pressures they're faced. So, I'm satisfied. I've no reason to doubt that this wasn't being done with the best of intentions. But it does, obviously reflect something that we need to act on, and we have corrected our guidance. £52 million is a very big sum of money, but in the health budget, again, as you will be well aware, probably equates to about, it's about 3 or 4 days spent.
It does worry me slightly, mind you, that you're the oversight of departmental spending. It's well above any threshold where there wouldn't be an eye kept on it. It strikes me as a bit odd that 52 million went a wall, even to a good cause, without your department actually knowing it.
Well, a sum of that nature couldn't go AWOL, as you describe it, in a department with a smaller budget. Like I said, this would be about, say, 4 days spend for health, but in my old department of data, it would be about 3 months spend, and I don't think we could have reallocated 52 million and not been caught on. But it does, I think, flag up a point.
They weren't caught on. It was only the audit office caught it.
Which again, I think I would make an argument that the audit office is part of the wider control mechanism that's in place. That Controller and Auditor General may wish to debate that with me later. But no, I accept we didn't catch it, but we are not actually set up to police intensely every pound that is spent by departments. We simply aren't resourced to do so. There is. DFP is often seen as being sort of the all-seeing, but the number of people who are actually involved in this budget management activity is a very small number of people, and they're intensely busy with a whole range of issues. We simply would not be equipped to start policing what departments do.
And have you checked to see if the £52 million expenditure was value for money? Have you actually found out where it went?
Frontline services.
Frontline services.
Whether it's front A&E, etc.
Yeah.
Well, have you dug slightly deeper to see if it was it effectively spent, given the fact that it wasn't actually meant for A&E pressures in the first place?
The short answer is we haven't done that. I question whether you would be able to trace where those £52 million actually went. But
knowing the previous minister, I'm sure it was very well spent. But I think it's important that you have that assurance. Because
no, sorry, we have been assured that it did go to priority frontline services, and again, as I said, I have no reason to doubt that.
It's an awful high proportion of the actual overall budget. Not the overall health budget, but the overall sort of, in monetary terms, there must be a threshold where you would be keeping an eye on a specific pot of money. And obviously 5 million, 10 million might be too small, but 52 million, is that not come into the sort of the realms of we're watching where that's going? No?
The Department of Health has quite considerable flexibility.
I was just going to say it's part of, I think, health officials' misinterpretation of the guidance, because the executive has given that department what's known as full budget discretion, and it can move money, its resource down to anywhere it wants effectively. It's at its own discretion, without recourse to the executive. Now, obviously, this was a ring-fenced fund, and they shouldn't have done that. They shouldn't have moved from a ring-fenced area into a non-ring-fenced area. But the key issue is that, yes, it was 52 million, but it was over 2 particular years, 13-14 and 14-15. Okay, it was roughly it was 23 million in both those 2 years. That was what it was. But you also recollect that was a period when that department had some incredible pressures. In fact, they actually overspent in one of those years. So there was an issue there about how tight they were, and that's why they diverted all available resources towards, what they call frontline services.
And I accept that, and I mean, from my experience, I'm absolutely certain that money was spent on the right thing. But it does flag up for other departments the ability to do this, where it may have gone to some pet project which may not have been as, beneficial to the community and is deserving?
I think there are sort of three issues moving forward that will probably preclude that. The first is that we've tightened up the guidance in terms of ring-fence funding, so departments can't misinterpret it moving forward. In terms of the change fund going forward, what we have introduced is mid-year evaluation. So we will go to the department in the middle of the year and we will find out what they've been doing with that funding at that stage, and then we're doing ex-post evaluation as well. So after the end of the financial year, we'll go back to the department and see how they've done in terms of the change fund going forward. So I think that we've learned some lessons there.
Thank you.
Thank you. I propose at this stage perhaps to wind up the session, and I think looking to the future and picking up just on what Jeff has said, am I to believe that in future there may be other schemes like this which will encourage risk-taking, innovation, working in partnership? And can we accept that perhaps in the past the permanent secretaries weren't up to it, and that in the future there will be a new culture which will encourage risk-taking and all the things that a modern government is expected to do? Perhaps reflecting on this session, Mr. Sterling, you can summarise for the committee what you see were the main benefits and outcomes from the Invest to Save funding provided in Northern Ireland, and whether you feel it operated to best effect.
Thank you, Chair. I think this has been a useful discussion. I think some important issues have been aired. Members have flagged up some concerns, some issues with the way the Invest to Save scheme operated. I think we've acknowledged, we've certainly explained what actually happened with a lot of those. We've acknowledged there were some weaknesses. We have explained that as far as some recent reform type funds are concerned, we have learnt many of the lessons which are set out in this report and have applied those. There are 8 recommendations in the Audit Office report which we would accept, and again which will inform the way we operate existing schemes and future schemes as well. I suppose the last point would be that despite all the concerns that were expressed, I still think that there has been value for money from the funding that was allocated to the Invest to Save scheme.
Okay. Members, we have now all had the opportunity to ask questions of witnesses. Are there any final issues that you wish to address before we conclude this session?
Thank you.
Mr. Caldwell, Ms. Caldwell and CNEG, is there anything you would wish to add regarding the evidence we've just received?
Chair, I'll just come back on a point Mr. Sterling alluded to earlier about whether or not the Audit Office is part of the control arrangements. I see the Audit Office as sitting outside the Civil Services internal control arrangement, because I'm really the Assembly's auditor. I suppose in relation to the 52 million anomaly, it's just by chance we'd picked that up. Had we not done an audit on Invest to Save, nobody would have ever known about it. So I think it's worth making that point. Second point is, I think there's been various figures quoted on what savings actually did materialise. I think our report talked about at 310, we surveyed departments, potted the figures up, the figure was about 150 million. There's a higher figure here today called, I think, 400 million. I think it would be helpful just to get a breakdown of that figure. It may be a more up-to-date figure than the one in our report. That's all I have to say, Chair.
Members, do you have any questions you would like clarification on from Ms. Caldwell or the CNAG?
No, I think it would be helpful to get those figures for the breakdown, if we have it right.
Yeah, we can do that. Yeah.
All right. Can I thank you all for your attendance before the committee today? It's been extremely useful, and information received will be taken on board as we develop our report. We may need to write to you seeking clarification on issues raised today and on other issues as they arise during our deliberations. Members, for the remaining items of business, it's necessary that we move into closed session. Are members content that we now move to closed session?
Agreed.
Good.
We are now in closed session. I thank the witnesses for their time.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you.